When we as historians look at history, it is easy and often quite helpful to look at certain events that occur during a certain period in time. Often, these events are either seen as symbols of the status quo of the time, or alternatively, the mark of a new, wildly different occurrence. On September 14th, 1862, the land of the rising sun very much experienced something that falls in the latter category. While on his way to visit the Heikenji Buddhist temple near Kawasaki, recently retired English merchant Charles Lennox Richardson was brutally murdered. While the death of an Englishman in foreign territory already may have been a blow for English and Japanese relations, the circumstances of the killing only escalated the situation further. As it turns out, the men who had killed Richardson were armed guards for Shimazu Hisamitsu, the daimyo of the Satsuma region. According to reports, Richardson and his party did not dismount for Shimazu, whose procession was riding towards them, and as punishment, one of Shimazu's men slashed Richardson. The violence did not end there, however, as Shimazu reportedly ordered for further attack on the brig. In the end, an autopsy revealed around 10 mortal wounds. While Richardson's death was in part motivated by his perceived lack of respect for the region, it is also extremely likely that other motivators were at play. The mid to late 19th century was an extremely odd time for Japanese international relations, and the Namamugi incident very much highlighted some of the oddities that occurred during the era. With that said, solely analyzing the 19th century would provide some, but not all, background as to why Richardson's murder may have occurred. This is simply due to the fact that the Namamugi incident was not a spur-of-the-moment occurrence, but rather a reflection of centuries of contentious international relations in need of exploring. The interconnectedness of history, and especially that of Japanese history, means that identifying an appropriate starting date to provide full context for certain events can be tricky. For this reason, I want to introduce an idea I call the 5 key years. This, I believe, is the appropriate first step. The first of the years, 1467, concerns the Sengoku period. The Sengoku period is so impactful to understanding both Japanese international relations, and more specifically Richardson's murder, because it marked the breakdown of Japanese government, providing ample opportunity for European powers to make their mark on the Japanese. The beginning of the Sengoku period marked the first stage of collapse for the Muromachi Bakufu, the government that had seized control after the fall of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333. The shogunate's loss in power was in most part due to a system in which the allocation of power left many provincial governors, or shugo, with massive control over local affairs. As these shugo grew more and more independent and powerful, the shogunate lost power equal to that gained by the shugo. This also meant that the shoguns were starting to lose control of the increasingly powerful Ashikaga warriors, grim foreshadowing for events yet to come. The event that put the Bakufu past the point of no return, however, was the Onin War of 1467. Although the war had started based on a succession dispute for the next shogun, the violence opened the door for other parties to begin combat, which continued even after the succession dispute was resolved. As a result, the Bakufu lost a great deal of power, Kyoto was destroyed, and warrior families had grown too independent for the Bakufu to control. Now, based on what we have discussed about the Richardson murder by itself, the connection may not be entirely clear. When looking at the fall of the Muromachi Bakufu, what is important to keep in mind are the long-term effects. Until 1600, Japan operated without a central government, in a constant state of power struggles between all types of different groups. This not only meant that Japan no longer had any sense of unified control, but it also provided ample opportunity for outside influences to interact with the newly decentralized nation. By the mid-16th century, Europeans were facing a new problem: no Silk Road. The Islamic empires of Arabia and Central Asia had shut down the most prolific trade route in the history of the world, and without it, Europeans struggled to get access to Eastern commodities they desired. This all changed, however, thanks to the Portuguese. The Portuguese reaching Japan in 1543 was a monumental achievement. Not only were they the first Europeans to ever engage the Japanese in trade, the ideas and goods they brought to the land of the rising sun helped to revolutionize the Japanese economy, while goods like bread, playing cards, and even tempura, which is often thought of as a Japanese staple, were introduced by the Portuguese, three main things were brought over: castles, firearms, and perhaps most controversially, Christianity. While firearms and castles both rapidly spread through Japan and became manufactured throughout the country, Japan seemed to exist as the most radical of the new ideas. While many of the physical goods were brought to Japan with the express purpose of reinvigorating East-West trade, Christianity had spread for an entirely different reason. Martin Luther's 95 Theses had sparked many a religious war in Europe, pitting his Reformationist ideas against the traditional counter-Reformationist ideas of the Church. In an effort to prevent the Reformation from gaining traction, many Christians traveled the world over to find converts. Naturally, some Jesuits, like St. Francis Xavier, made their way to Japan. And despite what one might think, for quite some time, the Jesuit missionaries and Japanese people maintained a good relationship. However, issues began to arise when this relationship grew, as some Japanese people were growing more concerned. Christian missionaries became more and more involved in local politics, and on top of that, the early 1600s saw more and more European missionaries come from many different countries. This was seen as a threat to some Japanese who were concerned of European imperialism as a reaction to less isolationist policies. As a result, the Japanese slowly grew discontent with the Jesuit missionaries, until both it and European trade as a whole were limited, eventually in a brutally violent fashion. 1614 marked the beginning of the horrifically inhumane removal of Christians, both European and Japanese, from Japan. Throughout southwest Japan, people were tortured or killed, with those surviving being forced to register as Buddhists. By 1637, no Portuguese, Spanish, or British ships were allowed in Japan, and trade through Nagasaki ran entirely through the Dutch, Koreans, and Chinese, along with trade with the Ryukyuan people. Once the 1640s had come to the close, the Tokugawa had expelled all Christian missionaries and followers found. This system of isolationist, anti-Western activity would remain in place for over 200 years until an American expedition changed the minds of Japanese. Well, kind of. While 18 previous expeditions to Japan had failed to coerce the Japanese into re-entering the worldwide trading market, the Perry expedition was soon to break through. Led by Matthew Perry, this one, not this one, the meticulously planned mission proved key to opening Japanese borders. Perry's plan was simple: show respect, but never give up. After a stop in Okinawa for a bit of a rehearsal run with the local regent, Perry moved forward. After some tense standoffs with Japanese officials, the Commodore refused to speak with anyone not directly connected to the Emperor. Perry passed his and President Fillmore's letters off to two princes, who then took the letters to the Emperor. Fitting the expedition's abrasive approach to a T, Perry and his squadron then simply waited for a decision, despite the pleas of the Japanese. By March of 1854, Perry and his advisors were once again present in Japan. By this time, Perry had convinced the Japanese leaders to open two harbors in Shimoto and Hakodate for supplies and coal, help shipwrecked sailors and return them to American representatives, have American citizens be given freedom of movement within the treaty ports, and have trade between the Americans and Japanese be conducted in the treaty. This is now known as the Treaty of Kanagawa, and it would mark the beginning of Japanese international relations for the first time in 2 centuries. Within another 4 years, Japan would continue to expand, becoming even more open to US, France, and Russia, just to name a few. With the sudden influx of merchants and trade came a cultural change for the Japanese. In the city of Yokohama, the principal point of international trade, new ideas and experiences were allowed to flourish. However, many Japanese were still wary of European intervention. While the 1860s saw the Japanese silk industry explode, it was also clear that anti-nationalist thoughts were still, perhaps justifiably, present. As we now know, this brings us to the murder of Charles Lennox Richardson. Now, one thing we haven't discussed is the fallout of this incident, and to tell you the truth, it was pretty spectacular. Generally, the category of guys getting killed and starting a war is pretty empty, save for one archduke, but Richardson joined the club. The bombardment of Kagoshima, aka the Anglo-Satsuma War, was a 2-day period in which the angry British tried and failed to get reparations for Richardson's death. Okay, so maybe the death of an archduke is a little more consequential than a retired British guy. Jokes aside, the events leading up to the Namamugi incident are fascinating to consider, both in length and as a domino effect. Going from a period of feudal, decentralized war to the introduction of Western influences, to the expulsion of those influences, to a guy who definitely didn't star in Friends breaking those barriers back down again, to one man's murder reigniting tensions on a hostile level, is one of the more fascinating progressions you can observe in Japanese history. It is an endlessly interesting tale of politics, religion, and international relations. And all you have to do is study 400 years worth of history to decipher.